You're about to step into a story. It's not a history lesson. It's not a sermon. And it's definitely not the version they told you in Sunday school. This is my personal, winding, sometimes ridiculous, often uncomfortable, absolutely fascinating journey into the cracks of the story I was raised to never question. If you came for clean answers and easy comfort, you might want to buckle up. Or maybe just run now. But if you're like me, if you ever sat there thinking, wait, that doesn't add up, then you're in the right place. Everything you hear is my own research, my own rabbit holes, my own rebellion, and the wild threads I keep pulling, even though I'm pretty sure they were supposed to stay neatly tucked away. And one last thing before we dive in. This podcast started in a garden. Now we are truly in nature. River flowing, trees surrounding us, birds singing, and unfortunately an aeroplane school very close by. So just enjoy. I will try to trim the aeroplane noises or even stop recording once that happens. That's why this podcast is taking ages. You guys wouldn't believe it. The amount of work that actually goes into all of this. It's a great hobby, don't get me wrong, but to actually record a clean episode where the sound is exactly as you want it, trust me, it's easier said than done. Anyways, welcome to Bloodline, episode 1. Not quite the beginning. You know how some people have these big dramatic moments when their entire worldview shatters? Yeah, mine didn't start like that. Mine started in my garden, on a random ordinary day, with my husband casually holding the family tree. We were tracing his ancestry, deep down one of those nerdy online rabbit holes, following his line all the way back to some half-mythical Viking ancestor, Rollo the Walker. We were laughing, just chilling, playing with generational timelines. And then he looked at me, and he asked them, the questions that cracked my world open like a dropped ceramic plate. How was the world created from your teachings? Such a casual question, right? Well, I didn't disappoint him. I answered exactly the way I'd always been taught. Well, God created the earth, then he created Adam and Eve, then Adam and Eve eat from the forbidden fruit and get kicked out of the garden, and then they have Cain and Abel, and Abel dies. Cain kills him out of jealousy. That was my answer. And then he goes, well, if Adam and Eve only had 2 sons, where did the rest of us come from? Once that second question was asked, something happened. It was like an avalanche of questions started rolling. Because here's the thing. I haven't been someone spending years quietly doubting in the background. I haven't been sitting here my whole adult life wrestling with forbidden questions. Oh no. My brain was fully conditioned. I didn't question anything. I lived inside the story exactly as I was taught it. Until that moment. That's when something cracked. And once it cracked, the questions started multiplying, one after another. Like dominoes I didn't even know existed, suddenly toppling all around me. So now that the forbidden question cracked something wide open, let's actually read this infamous opening scene properly. Sorry, got distracted by a butterfly. Let's actually read this infamous opening scene properly, shall we? Not with the quiet voice of Sunday school. Not with the rigid rules of doctrine. Not with, you better believe or else, fear wrapped in holy ribbons. But with fresh eyes. Our eyes. My eyes. Because if we're going to pull this thread, we pull it properly. In the beginning, Adam and Eve arrive, fully formed, fully adult, fully functional humans, placed directly into a garden curated by the Creator, a literal paradise. The trees, the animals, the rivers, all provided, and somewhere in this paradise stood two very specific trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. One was permitted, one was forbidden. Let's pause here, because this setup already feels like one of those parenting tactics where you put a toddler in a room, place a jar of sweets in front of them and say, "Don't touch it," and then you leave the room. What exactly do you expect the child to do? To sit there and hum Kumbaya? Oh, please. So here we are. Two brand new humans. Zero prior experience. No manual, no lived wisdom, but a divine ultimatum. Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. And now comes the snake, the serpent, a creature so controversial that entire doctrines have been built around its role. Was it Satan, a tempter, a rebel angel, or just the first one in the garden willing to ask inconvenient questions? The snake speaks in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? And Eve answers in Genesis chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. We may eat from the fruit trees in the garden, but God did say, "You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." And the serpent responds in Genesis chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. Pay attention, please. You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. There. That sentence alone is the fracture line of the entire human story. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. It wasn't a promise of rebellion. It was a promise of awareness. And if you think about it, that's terrifying to any system built on obedience. Because once you know, you question. Once you question, you choose. And once you choose, you own your power. Eve takes the fruit, and she eats it. She gives it to Adam, and he eats it. And guess what? The heavens don't explode. The earth doesn't crack open. Lightning doesn't fall. Instead, something far more dangerous happens. Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. And then comes God. In Genesis chapter 3, verses 9 to 11, "Where are you? I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Who told you that you were naked? Well, no one told them. The knowledge itself revealed it. And right here is where the story isn't just about a fruit or disobedience. This is where the emotional root of humanity gets planted. Shame, fear, vulnerability. Our first instinct wasn't violence. It wasn't greed. It was covering ourselves. Because with knowledge comes the terrifying responsibility of seeing what we are and deciding whether we're enough. Now, we're still just warming up here, because this so-called original sin isn't even where the biggest cracks are yet. Oh no, the real wild ride starts when we follow their children. This is where the story really starts to split at the seams. We have eaten the fruit. We have woken up. We've been kicked out of paradise, fig leaves still clumsily stitched together. And now comes the next piece of the puzzle that, let's be honest, most people just read past it like it's completely normal. And don't worry, I've done it so many times. It's unbelievable. So now we see. Adam and Eve begin the next chapter of their exiled lives. They have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And let's not forget, these are supposedly the only humans alive at this point. 2 parents, 2 brothers. Do you feel the itch? No? Mathematically, we are not starting strong. Cain is the farmer, Abel is the shepherd. Both bring offerings to God. Abel offers the best of his flock. Cain offers some of his crops. And for reasons the text doesn't exactly clarify, though plenty of theologians have tied themselves in knots trying, God favors Abel's sacrifice. Cain, not so much. And here comes the second emotional fracture of humanity recorded in Scripture. Rejection, jealousy, the desperate need for approval. Cain gets angry, and God warns him. Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Spoiler alert, Cain does not, in fact, rule over it. Instead, he invites his brother Abel out into the field and murders him. The first murder in the Bible, the first recorded act of human violence. And it's not a war, and it's not about land or power. It's about something much messier, sibling rivalry, rejection, the unbearable wound of not being enough. And now God returns, and you can almost hear the disappointment. Where is your brother Abel? And Cain responds with the ultimate snark. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And there, the fracture, the refusal of accountability. But God knows. Genesis chapter 4, verse 10. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And at this point, God issues the sentence. Cain is cursed from the ground itself. The soil that once grew his crops will no longer yield for him. He will be a restless wanderer on the earth. And now? Oh, now is where the story really starts to unravel into absurdity. Come with me. What does Cain say? Genesis chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Now, who exactly, whoever? Who is that? Who is out there exactly? Because we have only just been told about 4 people. Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel that now is deceased. And yet, Cain speaks as though there are others, many others. And what does God do? He doesn't tell him, oh, you're silly. There's no others out there. Off you go. Oh, no. God responds by marking Cain, some kind of protection, a mysterious sign, so that whoever finds him won't kill him. Oh, Cain leaves. He settles in the land of Nod, which literally means wandering. And there he gets married. To who, you ask? Well, the Bible simply says in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Where did she come from, you ask? Was she his sister? Another unnamed child of Adam and Eve? Or was there another group entirely? Who knows? Was Adam and Eve the first humans? Were they? Or just the first chosen humans? The first awakened ones? The laboratory test subjects? The first people in a very particular narrative, while the others just existed outside the garden's perimeter, living their own stories unrecorded by this version of events. And let's not forget, Cain not only marries and has a child, he builds an entire city. Yes, you heard it right. A city. No, not a tent or a hut. A city. Well, cities aren't built by two people and a toddler. You need a population for that. You need labor, craftsmen, families. So where did all these people come from? This is where Genesis starts dropping hints that the story we're being told is incomplete, or perhaps selectively edited. The math has been broken since Eden, and now the genealogy fractures even further. Cain's descendants are named. Men who forge tools, create music, build industries. Entire lines emerge, but with glaring absences. Have you noticed? The daughters, the wives, the rest of the people. Ghosts, unwritten, missing. The deeper you read, the louder the silence becomes, and the more you realize this isn't the neat, linear beginning you were handed as a child. This is a patchwork, an echo, a story stitched together with gaps. And we are only just getting started, because now we're going to pull at the next dangling thread. The silent women, the forbidden unions, the unspoken siblings, and why inbreeding might not just be a side effect of these early stories, but their very foundation. Before we dive any deeper into Cain's convenient mystery wife, we have to address the giant unspoken problem hovering in the margins of Genesis. Where are the women? Because while Genesis gives us names, genealogies, and patriarchal bragging rights, one after another, man after man, it gives almost nothing about the daughters. It tells us, in Genesis chapter 5 verse 4, after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Other sons and daughters. That's it. That's all we get. The whole line. No names, no stories, no mention of who these daughters were, how many were there, or even what happened to them. Just a polite footnote, a throwaway. Now, let's not pretend this was accidental, because if these daughters had been fully acknowledged, then someone would have had to spell out in black and white the thing that most of us have been side-eyeing since Sunday school. That in order for humanity to continue, these brothers married their sisters. It's inescapable. Either that, or there was some divine vending machine spitting out mystery humans behind Eden's hedges. Who knows? Anything is possible. But Genesis, being the heavily redacted, hyper-controlled text that it is, avoids the conversation entirely. Acknowledging the daughters as wives means acknowledging incest as the original mechanism for human multiplication. And that gets messy, especially when your sacred book later goes on to condemn incest in very firm terms. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 9. Do not have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter. Very clear, very strict. Except apparently not at the beginning. Yes, you're right. Now, interestingly, not every ancient text shies away from this problem. Outside Genesis, there are fragments that try to fill in the blanks. In the Book of Jubilees, one of those extra-biblical texts the mainstream canon quietly avoided, we are told Cain's wife had a name. She was called Awan, and yes, she was his sister. Simple, brutal, honest. The math that Genesis conveniently skipped. And there's more. Some rabbinical traditions, early oral stories, and apocryphal writings elaborate further, assigning names to Adam and Eve's daughters, like Azura, sometimes listed as Seth's wife, Lulua, and others. But you won't hear these names from the pulpit. They don't make comfortable sermon material. Because the moment you say out loud, the first families were interbreeding siblings, well, that destabilizes centuries of carefully curated doctrine. And here's the real kicker. Genesis quietly relies on these unnamed daughters to make its math work, while simultaneously pretending they don't matter. They exist, functionally, reproductively, but they are erased narratively. And now we start seeing the pattern emerge, because it's not just Genesis, it's the entire trajectory of patriarchal storytelling. The men get the lineages, the men get the names, the men get the power. The women? They get tucked behind the curtains, pulled out only when the story requires their wombs. And let's be clear, this selective silence wasn't because these stories lacked drama or complexity. If anything, the untold stories of those unnamed women would make far more gripping, brutal, unhuman storytelling than half the sanitized family trees we've inherited. But the silence was strategic, because to tell the truth, the full truth, would mean admitting that the so-called purity of bloodlines began with incest. Not as corruption, not as sin, but as necessity. And here is where it starts to echo far beyond Eden, because the erasure of women's names isn't limited to the Bible. Look across mythology. In Egypt, Isis gets her name, but most goddesses exist only as sisters, wives, or mothers of male gods. In Greece, the daughters of Titans, the Muses, the nymphs, footnotes in the tales of male heroes. In Norse sagas, goddesses get significantly less lineage lore than their male counterparts. Even in real-world royal genealogies, daughters were often listed only as bargaining chips for marriage alliances. The pattern is ancient and intentional, because when you erase the women, you erase complexity, you erase consent, you erase the awkward questions about power, choice, and survival. You erase the uncomfortable truth that humanity's origin story, whether divine or evolutionary, begins in messy, intimate proximity. And yet, here we are, reading between the lines, resurrecting the unwritten names, saying out loud what generations politely skipped. If we ever going to tell this story, we tell it all. The beautiful, the disturbing, the fragile, the inconvenient. Now hold on to this thread, because next we zoom out even further. This inbreeding problem? Oh, it's not unique to Eden. In fact, it shows up everywhere. By now, is your brain a bit like mine and is asking, wait, is it just this story? Or is it all of them? Because here's where things get even more suspicious. Genesis may have been the first version of the story I was handed. But as I kept pulling threads, as the forbidden question became a full-blown investigation, I noticed something far more universal. Everyone's origin story has incest baked into it. Not as a one-off, not as a dirty little exception, as a core feature. Let's start with the obvious one, the story that is literally sitting on every Bible cover, Genesis itself. Adam and Eve have children. Those children, with no other humans available, must marry who? Their own siblings, their own nieces, their own cousins. Inbreeding wasn't just present, it was required. Otherwise, the entire human race doesn't exist. And yet, for millennia, religious institutions somehow managed to avoid saying that part out loud. They say, Adam and Eve, the first humans, Cain and Abel, the first sons, other sons and daughters. But they never quite say what's obvious. This entire system starts with incest. The myth of a pure bloodline starts as early as Genesis. But here's the thing. Purity wasn't about ethics. Purity wasn't about holiness. Purity was about control. A closed system, a loop. Keep it contained, keep it divine, keep it ours. Genesis wasn't alone in this. Look across the ancient world. You'll find the same pattern repeating like a drumbeat. In ancient Egypt, where pharaohs were literally divine incarnations walking the earth, the system unfolds again. Osiris and Isis, brother and sister. Horus, son of that brother and sister union. The pharaohs who followed often married their sisters or half-sisters to preserve divine blood. Because when your right to rule comes from godhood, you better keep that godhood concentrated. You can't have peasants' blood sneaking into the throne room. Incest was never the taboo we're taught. It was sacred strategy. Same goes for the Greeks. Zeus marries his sister Hera. Cronus marries his sister Rhea. Their parents, Uranus and Gaia. Same tangled web. The Greek gods weren't embarrassed by incest. They practically boasted about it. The family tree of Mount Olympus? More like a family wreath. Tight, circular, and very awkward at family reunions. Even the ancient Persian Zoroastrian tradition leans directly into this. According to one version of creation, the first human pair were brother and sister. They married each other, and from their union came all humankind. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't shameful. It was the divine model. And let's not pretend real-world history escaped the loop either. From Mesopotamia to Madrid, kings, queens, pharaohs and emperors followed the same playbook. Royal families married cousins. Royal houses formed alliances through blood. Dynasties, as you say it, fused thrones by fusing gene pools. If you think the Habsburg jaw was some freak genetic accident, no. It was 200 years of intentionally repeated inbreeding. In fact, Charles II of Spain, who will absolutely spend time with him later, was so inbred his family tree looked like a circle. His great-grandparents were also his grandparents. His aunts were also his cousins. His uncle was also his brother-in-law. And surprise, he was physically devastated, mentally impaired, and the entire Spanish Habsburg line died with him. At this point, are you asking, is this all some gigantic collective coincidence? Or is something deeper at work here? Time after time, culture after culture, whether you're reading holy texts or mythologies or royal genealogies, they all keep arriving at the same model. Consolidate power by consolidating blood. Keep it closed, pure, controllable. They called it holiness. They called it divine order. But let's call it what it really was. An attempt to keep power locked inside a self-referencing loop. Interbreeding wasn't a failure. The failure came later, when the loop choked itself, when the bloodlines collapsed, when the physical consequences arrived like unpaid debts. The broken jaws, the deformities, the sterile hairs, the cognitive delays. And yet, even as history warns us, we still carry pieces of this instinct. We still fear outsiders. We still obsess over true bloodlines. We still gatekeep family, culture, religion, politics, and belonging like divine inheritance was a birthright. And this is where the crack in Eden grows into something far bigger than one garden, because the real story of Genesis isn't about a forbidden fruit. It's about how the earliest origin myths reflect our hunger to control who gets to belong. It's time to shift the lens again, because while we're busy talking about bloodlines and power, we need to circle back to something far more raw, far more human. Shame. Not murder. Not war. Not greed. Not lust. Not even betrayal. Shame. The very first human response to awakening was shame. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, "Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked." That one sentence holds more weight than most entire chapters. It's the fracture, the pivot, the moment humanity crossed from innocence into awareness. And let's be clear here. It wasn't sin that entered first. It was seeing. They looked down at their bodies, the same bodies they always had, and suddenly those bodies were unfamiliar, vulnerable, fragile. That's what knowledge does. It doesn't rewrite reality. It simply removes the veil. This is where most religious teachings rush in. They sinned. They disobeyed. They ruined paradise. I used to think like that, you know. I used to blame Adam and Eve for just ruining my life. I mean, I could have been literally living in a paradise, and I didn't because of them. Oh dear. But nobody really asks, why was shame the first emotional reaction? Because shame isn't evil. Shame is fragile. Shame is that burning sensation you get when you're suddenly aware you might be seen, fully seen for what you are, for who you are. And if you ever felt that heat rising in your chest, your neck flushing, your hands starting to tremble because you've been exposed, congratulations, you've touched the core of Eden. Let's go even deeper, because when God asks in Genesis chapter 3 verse 11, "Who told you that you were naked?" the answer is no one. No serpent whispered it. No divine being announced it. There was no external accusation. They simply knew. Knowledge itself birthed shame. Not because nakedness was suddenly evil, but because vulnerability had entered the room. And here's where this gets even wilder and a whole lot more honest. When the serpent told Eve in Genesis chapter 3 verse 4 and 5, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Technically, the snake didn't lie. Their eyes were opened. They did become aware. They now knew the difference between innocence and consequence. The divine threat wasn't death in the moment. It was the death of innocence. And isn't that painfully familiar? That's the essence of growing up. At some point, we all bite our version of that fruit. We all awaken. We all see the world as it is. Complicated, unfair, beautiful, terrifying. And once knowledge arrives, you don't get to put the fig leaf back. Awareness is irreversible. You can't unknow betrayal. You can't unsee injustice. You can't unfeel loss. Awareness strips away the comfort of blind safety and replaces it with choice. Now let's talk about that tree, that fruit, that forbidden knowledge. If God truly didn't want them to eat it, Why plant the tree of knowledge right in the middle of the garden? Why not place it far away? Why not hide it? Why did he have to make it centerpiece? Unless the test was never about obedience. The test was always about awakening. You see, Eden wasn't a paradise. It was a controlled environment, a spiritual nursery. Two fully formed adults, but spiritually children. Innocent, yes, but naive. The moment they chose knowledge, they graduated from innocence. They weren't destroyed. They were changed. And that change terrified the God who wanted them simple, safe, predictable. Because what is obedience, really? Obedience is easy when you don't know any better. True rebellion only exists once you've tasted awareness. And Adam and Eve, in that moment, tasted not just fruit, but sovereignty. Here's the bitter truth hiding beneath centuries of religious shame. The snake didn't curse them. The snake offered them evolution. And that's why the real fracture in this story isn't sin, it's agency. Humanity's fall wasn't a fall at all. It was a crossing. The first step into what it means to truly be human. Aware, ashamed, awake. And the punishment, the exile, that comes next. Because once you awaken, you no longer fit inside cages designed for innocence. And God wasn't ready for that. But we're not done yet. Because now that shame has entered and awareness has cracked the shell, it's time to follow where that knowledge leads next. And trust me, it gets weirder. Now we get to the creature that's been carrying the blame for basically everything. The snake, the most infamous supporting character in all religious history. The snake who's been demonized, vilified, and turned into the literal face of evil. The symbol of temptation, of the fall, of humanity's great shame. The one who supposedly tricked Eve, who led mankind astray, who seduced the world into sin. But let's pause. Let's slow this down. Because, if we're being honest, the snake might be the most misunderstood figure in this entire story. Let's strip away 2,000 years of church sermons. Let's ignore the Renaissance paintings, the half-woman, half-serpent horror movie. Let's forget the Sunday school lessons where the snake is Satan in disguise. Let's drop the apocalyptic fire and brimstone symbolism for just a moment. What do we actually know? We know this. The snake simply offered knowledge. Remember? The snake said, "You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." No fire, no threats, no lightning bolts. Just an offer, an invitation to awareness. Was that a lie? No, because what happened after they ate? The eyes of both were opened, exactly as the snake said. They didn't die. They didn't burst into flames. They became aware. The snake didn't deceive them. It told them the uncomfortable truth. You can see. You can know. You can choose. And that was the real forbidden act. The snake didn't curse them. It woke them up. And let's be brutally honest, that's dangerous to any system built on obedience. Because the second you grant knowledge, you grant the power to question. And once you question, you might not follow the rules anymore. You might say, "Hang on a second, why can't we eat from this tree? Who made that rule? What are you afraid we'll find out?" That's not rebellion against love. That's not rebellion against peace. That's rebellion against control. And here's where the snake flips from villain to liberator. Because what does the serpent represent in many other traditions? In ancient Mesopotamia, symbols of healing, rebirth, renewal. In Kundalini, spiritual awakening. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, I hope I said that right, bringer of wisdom. In medicine today, the caduceus, a serpent wrapped around a staff, symbol of healing. The snake isn't always evil. Sometimes it's the force that invites us to evolve. Maybe, just maybe, the snake was never the villain. Maybe it was the catalyst, the first teacher, the initiator of consciousness. It didn't create shame. Shame came afterward, from the system that couldn't handle what they now knew. The snake simply opened the door. God was the one who threw them out. Now think about this emotionally. What kind of parent says, "I want you to obey me, but I won't tell you why"? What kind of parent punishes their children, not for harming anyone, but simply for learning, not for violence, not for destruction, for awakening? This isn't about disobedience. This is about power. No one told them that they were naked. They saw themselves, their vulnerability, their humanness, their fragility, and instead of receiving comfort or guidance, they received exile. And who gets blamed? Yes, the snake, forever. And that's exactly why the snake matters. Because systems that want to control always need a villain. It's the serpent's fault you questioned. It's temptation's fault you disobeyed. It's evil's fault you dared to think for yourself. That's the great cosmic scapegoat. But I know better. The snake wasn't the problem. The real problem was awakening in a system that couldn't tolerate awakened beings. The real crime wasn't eating, it was seeing. And once you've seen, you cannot unsee. That's where the real story begins. Is why the snake stays in the room. Not as evil, but as the ancient whisper that says, "You're not a child anymore. You're capable. You can choose." And that is terrifying to anyone who profits from your obedience. The serpent has done its job. The apple's been bitten. The eyes are open. And now, standing outside the gates of Eden, humanity takes its first trembling steps into the wilderness, into bloodlines and unions and rebellions, into the strange tangled threads that will shape every origin story that follows. Because this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the complicated family tree we're about to unravel. This was never just a story about disobedience. It was always a story about awakening. The moment Eve reached for that fruit, something irreversible happened. Not evil, not corruption, but awareness. And from that awareness comes everything that terrifies any system built on control. The ability to see, the ability to ask, the terrifying, magnificent ability to choose. This wasn't about damnation, it was about evolution. And isn't that the rawest spiritual rebellion? Not to stay a child forever, not to sit forever in blind obedience, but to rise, to awaken, to step forward into the unknown, naked, vulnerable, fully human. The questions they never wanted us to ask, we're asking them now. Who was Cain afraid of? Where did his wife come from? Who were these other people building cities outside Eden? Why was shame the first emotion gifted to humanity? And who decided it should be called a sin? The cracks don't just appear in Genesis. They appear everywhere. In the myths, in the bloodlines, in the tangled stories across Egypt, Sumer, Babylon, Persia, the North, and even in the twisted branches of royal family trees centuries later. Because when you follow these threads far enough, they all start to sound eerily familiar. Divine unions, forbidden bloodlines, inbreeding masked as sacred purity, power passed through controlled wombs, rebellion crushed by shame. But I'll tell you something. This is where I begin my story, and maybe yours too. Because once you see the crack, you can't unsee it. And once you stop being afraid of it, you become free. We are not the descendants of perfection. We are the descendants of those who dare to awaken. We carry the bite of the apple, not as curse, but as the first breath of sovereignty. We carry the whisper of the snake, not as deception, but as an invitation to see beyond the veil. And this was just the forbidden question. Next time, we go deeper into the parts they were never meant to write down. Because Eden was never empty. The garden was only the center of one version of the story, but beyond its edges, there were others. Beings, bloodlines, unions that were never supposed to happen. Join me next time for episode 2. If this episode stirred your soul, triggered your brain, or made you whisper, "Finally," under your breath, come and find me on TikTok at wildlywoven279. That's where we pull the threads even further. Until then, keep asking, keep digging, and maybe don't eat fruit offered by overly friendly reptiles. Bye!